Support for Ben Franklin's World and the Doing History to the Revolution series comes from the Omohundro Institute and the Great Courses Plus. When we think about North America during the era of the American Revolution, most of our minds show us images and maps of Eastern Canada and of the 13 British American colonies that waged a revolution and war for independence against the British Empire. But what about the rest of the North American continent? What about the areas we know today as the Midwest, the Great Plains, the Southwest, the West, and the Pacific Northwest? What about Alaska? What went on in these other areas of North America while the 13 British American colonies waged their revolution and fight for independence? And for that matter, what did the American Revolution look like through the eyes of Native Americans? Did the revolution, its war, and the independent United States they produced impact them? To best understand the American Revolution, we must explore it from different vantage points. And as British Americans weren't the only people living in North America during the mid to late 18th century, we really need to explore what the revolution looked like within the larger context of the North American continent.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
North America is a vast place with a vast history. Therefore, it probably makes the most sense for us to start our new study of the Revolution with an overview of what the continent looked like beyond its eastern seaboard. We should explore the different tribal nations and peoples who live within its geographic borders, and find out whether there were any other important events that took place contemporaneously with the Revolution and likewise impacted the development of North America and the lives of its many people. I think the best way for us to explore this particular aspect of the early American past is for us to go back to a piece of this show's past. In episode 14, we spoke with Claudio Saunt, the Richard B. Russell Professor of American History and the Associate Director of the Institute of Native American Studies at the University of Georgia. We spoke with Claudio about similar themes when we discussed ideas from his book, West of the Revolution, An Uncommon History of 1776. Claudio has asked and thought deeply about answers to some of the same questions that we're asking now. So why don't we go pay another visit to Claudio? Claudio, thank you so much for joining us again. In West of the Revolution, you remind us that when we think about the American Revolution, our minds naturally conjure locations along the eastern seaboard of North America, and continental armies and continental congresses. But in fact, what we imagine as the continent and as North America is actually an area that represents just under 4% of the North American continent. And I wonder, would you tell us why you think we limit our historical imaginations to the mainland British colonies and their rebellion when we think about the American Revolution and North America between the years 1763 to 1783?
Well, I think there are at least three reasons. The first is simply that American history developed as part of a school curriculum that was dedicated to instilling a sense of nationalism and patriotism in its students. And so the history was therefore unabashedly about the origins and rise of the United States and not about the rest of the continent. So that's one reason. The second one is that the people who counted were white Americans, and Native Americans were understood or thought to be part of the past and destined to disappear, and therefore not historically important. And a third reason is that the early U.S. population and the most influential and prestigious universities were concentrated in the Northeast. So the historians working there wrote about what was around them, what was in essence local history, but they called it national history and confused their small corner with the continent as a whole.
You know, it sounds like when we think of the American Revolution in our traditional East Coast mindsets, we really limit our view of early American history and probably even of the revolution itself. Which begs the question, what happens when we extend our exploration of the American Revolution beyond the East Coast?
I mean, I think simply put, those early histories are teleological, right? If they're focusing exclusively on the American Revolution, it is undeniably teleological. In teleological history, we're looking for kind of the seeds in the past that explain the world today, and we identify those seeds and make the case that somehow inevitably the world evolves to create the world we know today. But obviously we're not good at predicting the future, and we're not really good at predicting the past either. There were multiple possibilities of what could have or might have happened in North America, and I think it's informative to explore all of those possibilities. And Atlantic history has obviously shown us that we cannot understand the history of the colonies without paying attention to Europe and Africa. But we also can't understand the history of North America as a whole if we're always focused on the Atlantic littoral.
You're right. There were many possibilities of what might have, could have, and even did happen in North America during the Revolutionary era. So why don't we start exploring some of those possibilities and happenings? Now, the Treaty of Paris 1763 ended the French and Indian or 7 Years' War, with the French, Spanish, and British dividing the North American continent along the Mississippi River. And at several points in west of the Revolution, Claudio discusses how this division actually created a lot of problems for both Euro-American colonists and Native Americans. Claudio, would you give us an example or two of how the European division of the North American continent along the Mississippi River actually proved quite inconvenient for the residents of the continent?
Yes, I'll give you a couple of quick examples. One would be the Creek Indians who lived in Georgia and Alabama, and they had long traded with the French, the Spanish, and the British. And they recognized immediately the threat that was posed to them when the continent was divided along the Mississippi River by European powers, because whereas they had once been able to trade with 3 different empires, now they were really forced to trade solely with the British. And as a result, in the 1760s, they actually struck out for Cuba in an attempt to sustain their trade with Spain. And they, in fact, nearly succeeded, but the events of the American Revolution intervened. So that's one example. A second example would be the Lakota people who recognized that they, too, were now dependent on access to British trade goods since their French trading partners were no longer present. But for a variety of reasons, the British trade was erratic. The Spanish presence in the area was minimal, and as a result, they, instead of actually turning eastward, they turned westward towards the enormous bison herds that were in the Great Plains. So they migrated west. They had once lived in western Minnesota, but they migrated west and eventually discovered, as they said, the Black Hills, which became their sacred homeland. And by one account, the discovery occurred in 1775 or 1776, the same year as the Declaration of Independence.
Another curious aspect of the French and Indian or 7 Years' War is how it temporarily ended conflict between European imperial powers, but led to protests, sometimes violent protests over imperial rule in British North America, and to violence between Native American peoples as far west as the Great Plains. How and why did the end of the French and Indian or 7 Years' War cause Native American violence as far west as the Great Plains, Claudio?
So I think probably the best-known example of violence that was set off by the end of the French and Indian War was Pontiac's Rebellion, which erupted in the Great Lakes region as a result of the expansion of the British into the area. The British were imperious. They were eager to establish their rule, even though they hadn't actually conquered anyone in the region. They had defeated the French, obviously, but hadn't defeated the many indigenous nations in the region. And they were contemptuous and dismissive of Native Americans, and Native Americans recognized that. So that led to this rebellion that was set off in 1763. And Pontiac's rebellion in turn disrupted trade across the Mississippi River, which affected the Lakotas, as I just mentioned. And then as the Lakotas expanded westward, they pushed out earlier residents of the Black Hills. So there was just this kind of sequence of repercussions that extended westward across the Great Plains. Now, by contrast, the Osages who lived further south in present-day Missouri found that they were actually advantaged by the geopolitical changes. Spain was a weak presence west of the Mississippi, and British smugglers carried trade goods into the region. So as a result, the Osages had to answer to no European power, and they expanded relentlessly over the last quarter of the 18th century. Jefferson would later observe that the Osages were the true power in that part of the continent.
You mentioned the Spanish. And when we think about the early American West, we can't help but think about the Spanish. They had settlements in the Gulf Coast, the Southwest, and in California. And given this presence, I guess it shouldn't be surprising that Spain watched and participated in the American Revolution. I mean, between 1776 and 1778, the Spanish helped smuggle arms and ammunition to the revolutionaries. And in June 1779, they joined the revolutionaries' fight against the British as allies of the French. So, Claudio, there must have been reasons for this. What exactly was going on in Spanish America during the American Revolution?
In North America, Spain was eager to reacquire what it had lost during the 7 Years' War when it had ceded Florida to Britain. So as a result, it sent out spies to monitor affairs in the rebellious British colonies. This was an effort that was largely centered in Cuba, and it kept in contact with indigenous peoples in the southeast who Spain thought might prove useful in the event of a potential conflict. This was also the era of the Bourbon Reforms, which was an effort to modernize the Spanish Empire, to eliminate burdensome trade regulations, and to open its markets. So for a time, it appeared that Indians in the Southeast would be the beneficiaries of this kind of Spanish interest in the region, but the revolution intervened and disrupted Creek Indian efforts to become the provisioners to the island of Cuba.
Now, just as the Spanish were looking east and keeping an eye on the progress of the American Revolution, they were also looking to the Northwest, specifically to Alaska. Claudio, would you tell us why the Spanish were keeping an eye on Alaska? Would you tell us what the Russians were doing there and along the coast of the Pacific Northwest during the 1770s and 1780s?
Russian fur trappers had expanded across Siberia over the course of the 17th century and reached the east coast of Siberia in, I believe it was the 1640s. By the 1740s, they had crossed the Bering Strait, and they were now working their way up the Aleutian Islands. They were in search of sea otters, which have the densest pelts of any mammal on Earth, and the pelts are beautifully lustrous. Unfortunately for the Russians, they needed local assistance to hunt the animals, so they depended on Aleuts and Aleut labor. And to secure that labor, they held Aleuts as ransom to force them to hunt for sea otters. They destroyed bidarkas, which are these beautiful and very sophisticated handcrafted boats that the Aleuts made and depended upon to feed themselves and their families. So it was really a coercive relationship, but the Russians found that they needed to use violence in order to get the Aleuts to hunt for them. Eventually, the Russians established an outpost as far south as Fort Ross, which is a couple hours north of San Francisco. So it was all part of this centuries-long effort to exploit fur-bearing animals in eastern lands.
Why were the Spanish so concerned with what the Russians were doing in Alaska and the Pacific Northwest? How did the Russians prompt the Spanish to think about colonizing California?
In retrospect, it's amusing, but no European knew exactly what the West Coast looked like. So there was a lot of confusion about who was where and how far apart they were from each other. The Spanish simply couldn't be sure whether the Russians were thousands of miles away from the valuable silver mines in Guanajuato, Mexico, or whether they were right next door. And to even further the confusion, Russia issued maps. These were valuable trade secrets, but issued maps that were intentionally misleading. So there was a tremendous amount of confusion about exactly where the Russians were. So the rumors of Russian expansion and the imagined threat led Spain to push its way up the west coast in the 1770s. So it established San Diego and Monterey in 1769 and 1770, and then my hometown of San Francisco in 1776.
Was the Spanish interest in settling California just to keep the Russians far away from their more lucrative colonies to the south? I mean, why were the Spanish interested in California?
There was nothing particularly valuable about California itself. There were no resources that Spain was interested in exploiting. So the motivation really was twofold. There was a drive on the part of Franciscans to convert indigenous peoples. That was certainly true. But then the second part was that because of this uncertainty about where the Russians were, there was always this fear that there was a great river. Some people said it maybe entered the San Francisco Bay Area, but that there was a river that coursed through California and turned south and ended up somewhere in northern New Mexico. So the fear then was that whichever European power got hold of this river, they'd simply be able to sail upriver and take over these valuable Spanish possessions. So there was this real geostrategic reason for establishing outposts on the California coast.
Now, one of the themes of your book, West of the Revolution, is interconnectedness and contingency. How actions in one place usually had ripple effects that led to actions and consequences in another place. To take our conversation back east towards the Revolution, did the fact that the Creek and Choctaw peoples, who you mentioned earlier, did the fact that they got caught up in the military aspects of the American Revolution impact or have any ripple effects for Native American peoples who live further west?
Well, in some ways, the American Revolution wasn't the most important event for these peoples. Inevitably, there were repercussions, but I think they were fighting larger and longer-term battles with how to adapt to the presence of Europeans, and whether they were trading with the British or trading with an independent and newly created United States, I think was less important to them than these larger questions about how to retain their sovereignty and how to sustain themselves amidst these really significant environmental changes that were unleashed by Europeans.
Would you give us an example or two of how Native American peoples responded to the increased European and American presence in the heart of the continent?
So there's the example of the Osages, which I've mentioned. In this case, it proves to be advantageous to them to be able to trade with the British in the East Coast and more or less ignore or rule over the Spanish in the middle of the continent, and they create an empire in the same way as Pekka Hamalainen has written about the Comanche Empire in the late 18th century. There are also the Mandan peoples in the upper Missouri River who lived on what historians call the gun and horse frontier. Guns were coming from the East Coast, and the edge of that frontier was along the Missouri River, and then horses were coming from the southwest up through the Great Plains. And so they were located on this very valuable midpoint, and they were the go-between in this extraordinarily profitable trade, which benefited them for a time. And then they were eventually overtaken by disease that was introduced by Europeans.
As you mentioned, the American Revolution wasn't the most important event in the lives of most Native American peoples. But given the level of interconnectedness and contingency that we've discussed throughout our conversation, did the American Revolution and its result of independence have any broad ramifications for the North American continent and Native American peoples?
Yeah, I think Britain was an empire that had interests around the world and was willing to make compromises with indigenous peoples to avoid conflicts that it simply didn't want to deal with. The United States, by contrast, was not a worldwide empire at the time. Its empire really rested in the West, in Western lands, and therefore it had no interest in compromising with indigenous peoples. When it wanted to expand, it simply expanded. So there's that, but I also think it's worth also rephrasing the question and thinking less about the ramifications of American independence and more about the interdependence that remade North America. And this is a theme that I played with in my book, West of the Revolution. These far-flung trade connections meant that Aleut fishermen on the Aleutian Islands were affected by consumer demand in China. It meant that Cree and Assiniboine hunters in the Canadian prairies were connected to the European fashion industry through the beaver pelt hat. And of course, the harvesting of natural resources sets off a cascade of ecological consequences that shape the lives of Americans in really profound ways. And we're still struggling to understand today exactly all of the ecological implications. So for me, I think it's interdependence as much as independence that's the most captivating story in 18th century North America.
So it turns out that there was a lot going on across North America as the British American colonists waged their revolution and war for independence. The end of the 7 Years' War changed the geopolitics of North America. The war saw the British dismiss the French from the continent, the Spanish position weaken, and changed the dynamics of power and trade for many tribal nations. After the war, the Creeks sought to keep their trade prices competitive by re-establishing trade ties with the Spanish in Cuba. The Lakota found British trade to be so erratic that they turned westward toward the great bison herds of the Great Plains and made their way into the Black Hills of South Dakota and Wyoming, which they then made their sacred homeland after they displaced other native groups. Meanwhile, the Osage people, who lived around present-day Missouri, found that the geopolitical changes wrought by the 7 Years' War favored them, and they expanded their power and territorial holdings in the middle of the continent. Now, further north and west, in Alaska, we find the Russians hunting for sea otters and wreaking havoc on Aleut communities, which made the Spanish nervous enough about the security of their bullion mines down in Mexico that they pressed north and west into California to create buffer settlements against the perceived Russian threat, as well as to convert the native peoples of California to Catholicism. But why don't we notice all of this important history when we study North America during the American Revolutionary era? Claudio pointed us to 3 reasons why we rarely look west when we study the American Revolution. And all 3 of these reasons have to do with the way that Americans wrote their first history books. 1. American history was originally designed to instill a sense of nationalism and patriotism in the American people. Therefore, the earliest histories were unabashedly about the origins of the United States. 2. At the time when historians wrote these earliest histories of the United States, they viewed white people as the only important people. And 3, the earliest historians wrote only about what was around them, which were the people and events centered along the eastern seaboard, the events of the 13 British North American colonies and their American Revolution. Now, as Claudio revealed, when we study the American Revolution within the context of the larger history of the North American continent, we find that the American Revolution just wasn't the most important event going on as far as most of the continent's inhabitants were concerned. For most North American inhabitants, the biggest fight wasn't about independence from the British Empire. It was about the right to retain their sovereignty as tribal nations and how to adapt to all the environmental and demographic changes that came as people moved across the continent and harvested its rich natural resources. So now that we have some broad answers to our broad questions, let's get a bit more focused. Let's explore how one group of indigenous people lived through and experienced the Revolutionary era, and see how they responded and adapted to the geopolitical changes that took place during the period. Now, as Claudio took us pretty far west across the continent, let's come back east and explore the experiences of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people. Haudenosaunee ancestral territories spanned across what is now New York State, and their influence among other Native American peoples spanned even further, as far south as Tennessee and as far west as the Mississippi River. The Haudenosaunee participated in the Revolutionary War in various ways, all to protect their people and their territory. And after the war, they confronted the first territorial expansion attempts by the new United States. Exploring the Haudenosaunee will allow us to see just what the American Revolution looked like to some Native Americans, and how one people responded to the continent's changing geopolitics. Alyssa Mount Pleasant will be an able leader for our investigation of the Haudenosaunee. She's an assistant professor of Native American Studies in the Department of Transnational Studies at the University at Buffalo. She works at the intersection of Native American and Indigenous studies, and her area of expertise is the history of the Haudenosaunee. She's published many articles, and she's at work on a book tentatively titled After the Whirlwind, Haudenosaunee people and the emergence of U.S. settler colonialism, 1780 to 1825. But before we meet Alyssa, we should take a moment to explore the work of our episode sponsor, the Great Courses Plus. Are you enjoying our investigation of the North American continent during the American Revolution and what the Revolution meant for Native American peoples? If so, you should know that the Great Courses Plus has a course called Native Peoples of North America, where you can explore the issues and themes that we've been investigating in this episode in even more detail. Plus, you can explore it all for free during the unlimited free month trial that the Great Courses Plus would like to give you when you visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. In the course Native Peoples of North America, the Great Courses Plus aims to provide you with new perspectives on the historical and contemporary experiences of Native American peoples and their significant impact on the history of North America. Now, to achieve this, they created this course in partnership with both the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian and with University of North Carolina Chapel Hill professor Daniel M. Cobb. In this course, you'll find a 31-minute video, which you can watch entirely on your own schedule and on any device with an internet connection. You'll find a course called The American Revolution Through Native Eyes, in which Professor Cobb explores 3 ways Native Americans experienced the Revolution: as allies, as participants in their own civil wars, and as neutral parties. He'll also discuss how the end of the Revolution held little meaning for most Native Americans. Visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld so you can take your investigation of Native American history further with Native Peoples of North America, and with this particular lecture, The American Revolution Through Native Eyes. Again, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld to sign up for your free unlimited month of courses. Alyssa, who are the Haudenosaunee people? Would you tell us about them, where they lived, and what their culture and society was like by the mid to late 18th century?
So the term Haudenosaunee means people building a house or people of the longhouse. And in the 20th century, it typically refers to the 6 nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora nations. In the mid to late 18th century, the Tuscarora had recently joined the 6 nations and become effectively the 6th nation. Haudenosaunee people during that time period had significant settlements throughout what is today's central and western New York, from the Mohawk Valley all the way to Lake Erie. And there were dozens of towns and villages of varying scales. Reports from the 1779 Scorched Earth campaign by Major General John Sullivan document over 40 communities in the Finger Lakes region of New York State alone. In terms of what the communities looked like, they had massive agricultural fields, orchards. They had some livestock that roamed freely, and there were a variety of house forms, from the traditional longhouse, which is a multifamily dwelling, to those that outwardly appeared much more similar to colonial dwellings of the period. In terms of the economy, agriculture, fishing, hunting, gathering, and trade all had an important place. And in terms of the organization within communities, Haudenosaunee people had matrilineal and also matrilocal social organizations, so clans, which are one of the major forms of identification. In addition to identification with a particular nation, is something that descends through the mother. In terms of relationships with colonists, by the mid to late 18th century, Haudenosaunee people had over 150 years of experience dealing with colonists in a variety of capacities. In some cases, they were neighbors, especially in the Mohawk Valley. Sometimes they were tenants. David Preston's written a valuable study looking at tenancy and leasing by Haudenosaunee people. Also, they might be part of extended families. Sir William Johnson, for example, is a very well-known instance of prominent colonial figure who is part of a much larger Mohawk kin network. He was married to Molly Brant. Also, missionaries have relationships with Haudenosaunee people in a variety of regions. And additionally, Haudenosaunee people on the borderlands in places like the Upper Susquehanna River had multinational settlements where they received people who had been displaced by colonial violence.
So the Haudenosaunee had really dynamic multicultural societies.
Absolutely. With a wide range of relationships, a long-standing social and political formations that have a significant role in both their organization internally and also in terms of their external relationships with other Native people and also non-Native people.
Could we look at some of the Haudenosaunee's internal and external relationships? Because among other Native American peoples, Europeans, and American settlers, the Haudenosaunee had a reputation for being a very powerful people who were highly skilled as both warriors and diplomats. So I wonder if you would tell us a bit about Haudenosaunee diplomacy.
Certainly. One of the places to start with this is that there has been a great deal of interest among scholars and before that among colonists themselves about Haudenosaunee diplomacy and governance. Part of that was the significant military presence that Haudenosaunee people had in the Northeast, as well as their influence among neighboring and even distant tribal nations. So in 1727, Cadwallader Colden published the History of the Five Indian Nations, which is one of the first published studies of Haudenosaunee people. And I think, it's an important publication that signals the sustained interest that colonial figures had in understanding Haudenosaunee society, history, forms of governance, etc. And then far more recently, one scholar who was writing in the 1990s suggested that Haudenosaunee people have actually been overstudied. Lots of folks have pushed back against that since that publication, but it, I think, speaks to the long-term fascination, if you will, with Haudenosaunee people and particularly Haudenosaunee diplomacy. That's also reflective of the efficacy and prominence of Haudenosaunee people in the Northeast. And I would argue that this prominence and this efficacy is a consequence of a system of governance and way of life that's described and prescribed in Ganeshagoa, or the Great Law of Peace. This is a living tradition. Great Law recitals occur up through the present day. The Tonawanda Seneca Reservation hosted a week-long recitation this past summer, and there are plans to host another recitation at the Tuscarora Reservation in the summer of 2018. And there are currently 3 reservation territories that continue to practice traditional governance as their only form of governance. And the Great Law of Peace, or Ganeshagoa, is obviously, given the references to the length of time that it takes to recite the law, is something that is incredibly detailed and complex, and it informs not only relationships among and between Haudenosaunee member nations, if you will, but also with neighboring peoples, native and non-native.
Could we explore Ganeshagoa, or the Great Law of Peace, in more detail? Would you tell us more about it?
So a brief synopsis is always going to be inadequate, but this is a socio-political philosophy that indigenous knowledge keepers and scholars have been studying for ages and continue to talk about. But it is, in a nutshell, a tradition. It's a form of governance that emerged during a period of tremendous strife among 5 nations in today's New York State. It was brought to Haudenosaunee people by a significant figure who's known as the Peacemaker as a way to provide guidance and outline appropriate relationships between peoples and to respond to internecine violence that was incredibly disruptive to nations and communities at that time. One of the things that I think maybe is useful for discussions of relations with non-native peoples and also with Native peoples as well, is that there is within the Great Law of Peace some guidance and acknowledgement about grief, particularly grief that surrounds the loss of loved ones and leadership and the consequences of that grief if it's not adequately acknowledged and dealt with. Part of the context for the Great Law is that there was ongoing and escalating violence among the Five Nations at the time that the peacemaker visited. And he proposed some protocols for condoling people, offering condolences for people who have suffered loss so that they can address their grief and resist efforts to strike out violently and continue these cycles of death and destruction. And these protocols of condolence, these protocols for addressing grief allowed people to come to a better mental framework, right? A healthier way of thinking and what Haudenosaunee people talk about as the good mind. And when people have a good mind, they can have good, healthy relationships among themselves and also with other peoples. So as a result, they're able to move beyond violent tendencies, right? So this is the groundwork that the peacemaker presented to Haudenosaunee people to allow them to come to a place where they could move beyond these violent impulses and develop relationships that respected individual nations and individuals within those nations to come together in a form of governance that would respond to, among other things, loss of life in more productive ways. And so there's a lot more to say about it, obviously, but the protocol of condolence is something that emerges in the diplomatic record in important ways. And in a diplomatic context, there is a protocol where visitors to communities are welcomed at the edge of the settlement. And as a preface to productive conversation, there's a process for clearing people's eyes, clearing their ears, clearing their throats, acknowledging losses that they might have experienced recently, also acknowledging other impediments to productive conversation. And this is something that's repeated over and over again in the diplomatic record that we see from the colonial period and also the early American period. It's a way to set the proper tone for engagement with one another, and the forms that that engagement can take vary, and the results of that engagement also varies, but at the base, it is intended to create a productive context for dialogue and for diplomacy. One of the prominent symbols of the Great Law of Peace is a wampum belt, and there are numerous wampum belts that are associated with the Great Law and that convey the messages of the Great Law. One of these belts is frequently referred to as the Hiawatha Belt. And this is a prominent symbol for Haudenosaunee nations and the form of governance and cooperation among the nations that emerged as a result of the peacemaker's message. Visually, it can be described as a chain of sorts that has links that represent each of the five nations. And it's a chain that also has openings at either end that signal the possibility that other nations and other people might potentially join with the Great Law, embrace its message, and become members, if you will. And this is how the Tuscarora Nation came to be the sixth member of the Haudenosaunee. So the Great Law is expansive. It anticipates possibilities that others might embrace the message of peace, power, and righteousness that the peacemaker conveyed. And it's also a model of governance that in certain ways has been adapted over time. The vision of expansion, right, is something that during the 17th century didn't work, right, in relationships with Dutch and then English colonists. So as a result of the recognition that Dutch and English colonists were not interested in subscribing to the Great Law, Haudenosaunee people developed another approach. And that is symbolized in Goswenta, which is another wampum belt that is often referred to as the two-row wampum. And that is visually a belt that, as it's described, has two rows of beads, a row of purple beads and a row of white beads that run parallel to one another and that are described as embodying the understanding that it's possible for Haudenosaunee nations and colonial nations to coexist, and also indicates the expectation of non-interference in the government, religion, and way of life of one or the other.
It seems like these protocols of grief and grievance prescribed by the Great Law must have been very important during periods of war, like during the American Revolution and its war for independence. And as we know, both of these events confronted and divided both British American communities and Native American communities. So, Alyssa, would you tell us how the Haudenosaunee responded to and experienced the Revolution and its war?
That's a big topic. I guess one of the first things I want to do is that there certainly are plenty of grievances that Haudenosaunee people had during the colonial period, and they worked to the extent that it was possible to address those grievances through diplomatic measures. And that's different than grief that I was talking about with connection to the Great Law of Peace. I think grievance and grief are not disconnected, but in the context of the Great Law, grief is about the loss of life, right? The loss of human life. In terms of thinking about the Revolutionary War and Haudenosaunee people, as my example of Goswenta, or the two-row wampum, indicates, Haudenosaunee people are pragmatic, and in the Revolutionary War, they're, and still to the present day, interested in protecting the territory or territories and the people. So when we look at the outset of the Revolutionary War, one of the initial messages that Haudenosaunee people received from both British and American representatives was that this was an internal conflict that they did not need to be involved with. Initially, they were very strongly encouraged to remain neutral. It didn't take long for both the British and the Americans to shift their approach to their conversations with Haudenosaunee people about the conflict and to solicit support. Depending on the particular location that the nations had, they took a variety of approaches to relationships and involvement in the Revolutionary War. So Oneidas, for example, whose territory was located in a region that was closest to the colonial settlements in the Mohawk Valley and points west, and took an approach where they supported the American effort. Mohawks, whose territory further east had already been significantly affected by colonial expansion, had strong relationships with the British that in some ways are related to the kin connections they had with Sir William Johnson, who was a British official working in Indian affairs, supported the British cause. And tribal nations that were further geographically removed from colonial settlements tended to support the British effort as well, and to reinforce their longstanding alliance with the British through a series of actions in a variety of locations, whether that is in border warfare, targeting colonial settlements, or in other places like the Battle of Oriskany. And the Haudenosaunee people maintained these alliances through the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and experienced significant consequences as a result.
Yeah, we should talk about the Treaty of Paris 1783. We know that it ended the Americans' war for independence by securing independence for the new United States. But what did this treaty mean for the Haudenosaunee and other Native American peoples?
So Native people and tribal nations were already independent, right? They're sovereign nations that had alliances with a variety of colonial powers, whether they're French, British, Spanish, etc. And one of the things that was really significant about the Treaty of Paris is that the terms of the agreement were shocking to Native people. They considered themselves independent. They had, as I mentioned before, alliances, diplomatic relationships, and they had fought beside the British in many cases because of these alliances and this longstanding diplomatic relationship. And in the early 1780s, many of these nations and their warriors were successfully defending their territories. So news of British capitulation didn't align with their experiences of the conflict. The terms of the treaty itself granted to Americans claims to territory that the British had no control over and didn't have any right to cede. So that was shocking and deeply upsetting to tribal nations on a number of levels. They had effectively been abandoned at the negotiating table, and certainly their interests weren't represented by their erstwhile allies. Following the Treaty of Paris, Americans moved to call for meetings with various groups of tribal nations and to negotiate, which is a term that I use loosely in this context, a number of treaties between 1784 and 1786. At these meetings, American diplomats staged gatherings and conversation that were premised on the idea that they had defeated Native people. They took coercive approaches to the development of these documents. So in 1784 at Fort Stanwix, there is a treaty agreement that provides a good example of how this worked. For Haudenosaunee people who attended this conference, these diplomats were not authorized to make land cessions. However, Americans were insistent on land cessions. They were insistent on the language of conquest. And they actually took hostages in part of their process for coercing an agreement that made vast claims to Haudenosaunee territory and submission. The treaties that took place in the mid-1780s, understandably, given the circumstances that I've described, prompted ongoing resistance, both violent resistance and also resistance that took place in diplomatic contexts. For Haudenosaunee people, they pursued a variety of strategies for addressing this very difficult situation, which included diplomatic efforts in a number of fronts, both along the eastern seaboard in colonial centers and also in the Great Lakes with other Native peoples as they attempted to make sense of a tremendously tumultuous period that threatened their independence, their territorial integrity, and their sovereignty in a number of ways.
As Alyssa described, the Haudenosaunee adopted a very diplomatic form of resistance to the Americans' post-revolution migrations and land grab. I mean, in New York alone, we're talking about 700,000 to 800,000 New Englanders migrating into New York State and claiming native lands as their own between 1783 and 1830. But not all Native American peoples resisted territorial claims with diplomacy. Alyssa, would you tell us what happened in the Ohio Valley during the mid to late 1780s?
Well, one of the things that people often don't realize when discussing the conclusion of the Revolutionary War is that violence continued in the Ohio country through the 1790s. For people in the Ohio country, for Native people in the Ohio country, they had been dealing with colonial expansion for decades. And they were, speaking quite broadly here, there's extensive commitment to ongoing resistance to this expansion. They faced a different sort of incursion of colonists than Haudenosaunee people did. They had a much larger population of Americans who were interested and actively seeking to move into their territory. They mounted an armed defense against this invasion. This was an ongoing struggle that the United States devoted tremendous resources to. So, for example, in the early 1790s, Secretary of War Henry Knox requested 5,000 troops and annual expenditures that exceeded $1 million in order to prosecute efforts for American expansion into the region. In 1791, there were 2,700 troops who were stationed in the Ohio country, and they represented about 80% of American forces at that time. So there's a tremendous amount of militarization of this region. Native people experienced some significant victories early on in this process. So, for example, in 1791, troops who were led by General Arthur Sinclair experienced a massive defeat along the Wabash when they faced an intertribal force of Miamis, Shawnees, Delawares, Potawatomis, and other native people from the region. Americans suffered over 600 deaths of soldiers and militiamen, and several hundred people were wounded. That amounted to about half of Sinclair's troops. For Haudenosaunee people in their homelands, they had already experienced an invasion and significant devastation during the Revolutionary War in the 1779 campaign that was prosecuted by Major General John Sullivan. And when I look at the records of this period, one of the things that is striking to me is the ways in which Haudenosaunee people actively resisted pressures to become involved in the violence in the Ohio country. And this was pressure that they received both from tribal nations in the Ohio country and also from the United States, and the ways in which they worked to avoid a similar violence within their communities that they were witnessing happening to the south and west of their territory.
Now, how did these disagreements, which we've been talking about over land and diplomacy, turn out when they did find some resolution in 1794? Did war or diplomacy prove more effective as Native Americans defended their territories from land-hungry Americans?
Well, we do see two different outcomes in 1794. In the Ohio country, tribal nations suffer military defeat at the hands of Americans. And at the same time, very shortly after this defeat in the fall of 1794, Haudenosaunee people successfully negotiate an agreement with Americans at Canandaigua. This Treaty of Canandaigua is a treaty that I argue is the outcome of a decade of concerted efforts at diplomacy by Haudenosaunee people who are pursuing a variety of efforts to reach out to American representatives, American diplomats, American officials, and effectively reshape their relationship with the United States that is described in the terms of the Treaty of Fort Stanwix from 1784. The Treaty of Canandaigua is the result of also ongoing educational efforts on the part of Haudenosaunee diplomats. At the end of the Revolutionary War, as Americans worked to assert their authority and claims of conquest, the people who were conducting these efforts were folks who lacked experience in diplomacy and in relationships with Native people. It was the British, right, who had their Indian department and long-standing diplomatic relationships, understood protocols, knew the languages, all of these types of things that make diplomacy possible. So there was a tremendous learning curve for Americans as they tried to develop some sense of cultural literacy, if you will. And Haudenosaunee people who were invested in rectifying the diplomatic relationship, if you will, took on the task of educating American officials. And Timothy Pickering, who presided over the negotiations at Canandaigua in 1794, was someone who was receptive to these overtures and was willing and able to learn about proper protocols for diplomacy within a Haudenosaunee context. And of course, he's able to acquire this knowledge because there are Haudenosaunee people who are working in a number of ways to teach him how these interactions work. And this comes out of a commitment to avoid further destruction of communities and further violence against Haudenosaunee communities that were in the midst of an ongoing recovery following the 1779 invasion of their territories by Americans.
We've been talking a lot about land and diplomacy. Did the American Revolution impact or have any other lasting impacts for the Haudenosaunee or other Native American peoples that we should really think about and consider?
Well, the American Revolution created a context for the emergence of a new settler colonial nation, a new nation that was and is predicated on the absorption of the territories of tribal nations. And this emerges most clearly in the period that we're talking about in these treaties from the mid-1780s. And then you see a variety of responses to these assertions, right, of conquest. And then for Native peoples in the wake of the Revolutionary War, there are extraordinary pressures that emerge in a variety of ways against land, against the social, political, spiritual practices of Native peoples as the United States works to assert its authority over Native people and tribal nations and to eliminate those nations in a variety of ways. Some of my work has touched on the so-called civilization program that emerges in the 1790s as an extension of much earlier efforts to convert Native people to Christianity and incorporate Native people into colonial society as subservient members of that society. So there's a variety of ways in which the Revolutionary War has immediate and ongoing consequences for tribal nations. And another thing to know about this is that despite these efforts, in the present day, there are over 560 tribal nations that have nation-to-nation relationships with the United States. And so nation-to-nation and government-to-government relationships. For Haudenosaunee people, their territory, particularly Seneca people, Cayuga people, and Onondaga people, their territory is opened to settlement by Americans following treaties in the late 1790s, and particularly, and this is a process that really accelerates after the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825. And so we see ongoing struggles on the ground to deal with some of the larger patterns that I just described.
When we look at the American Revolution through Native American eyes, we need to consider their cultures and experiences. By the time of the Revolution, the Haudenosaunee, for example, had interacted with Europeans and Euro-Americans for over 150 years. Their protocol or approach to these interactions, Gusventa, which was an adaptation of the Great Law of Peace, shows us that the Haudenosaunee were really pragmatic in the ways that they protected their territory, sovereignty, and people. They really believed that it was possible for them to live peaceably with Europeans and American colonists if all parties respected the government, religion, and way of life of each other. And the Haudenosaunee followed Gusventa and tried to be respectful during the American Revolution. When both the British and revolutionaries beseeched them to stay out of their conflict, they obliged. Yet, when both parties turned around and started asking the Haudenosaunee to help in their fight, each nation carefully considered how best to protect their lands, people, sovereignty, and relationships before they acted. As Alyssa revealed, the Mohawk lived in areas that had been strongly impacted by colonial settlement and expansion. As a result, they had strong relationships with the British and even some kinship ties. So, when the British asked them to help them in their war effort, the Mohawk determined that the best way to protect their lands, people, and sovereignty was to assist the British. The Oneida, on the other hand, had territory that was closest to colonial settlements in the Mohawk Valley. So, when they considered the calls of both the British and revolutionaries to support their war efforts, the Oneida determined that the best way to protect their lands, people, and sovereignty was to assist their revolutionary neighbors. Meanwhile, the other Haudenosaunee nations lived further removed from colonial settlements and therefore tended to either support the British or practice neutrality, because they thought that these measures would best serve their interests. Yet, as involved in the Revolutionary War as the Haudenosaunee and other Native American peoples were, neither the British nor the revolutionaries consulted them when they sat down to negotiate the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Instead of being treated as the independent, sovereign nations and allies that they were, the British abandoned their allies and the Americans treated them as conquered peoples. As Alyssa mentioned, neither of these viewpoints jived with how most Native Americans experienced the war. In the early 1780s, many Native American peoples had been successfully defending their lands. So news of the British capitulation came as a shock, as did the British land cessions. Although they had no right to do so, the British ceded Native American lands to the United States. After the war, Americans tried to push west and secure the new territories and borders described in the Treaty of Paris. The United States government sent diplomats with little to no experience in Native American diplomacy to negotiate land cessions that would recognize its new territorial claims. Naturally, these indelicate and imperious attempts met with resistance from Native Americans. In the Ohio Country, Native American peoples committed themselves to defending their people's sovereignty and territory from American incursions with force. The United States devoted a tremendous amount of resources to defeat this armed resistance. In the early 1790s, Henry Knox stationed 2,700 soldiers, or roughly 80% of the United States Army at the time, and requested more than $1 million, a huge sum, all to force the government's land claims on the region's inhabitants. Likewise, the United States demanded that the Haudenosaunee formally cede territories that they believed they had won in their victory over the British. The Haudenosaunee also committed themselves to defending their lands, people, and sovereignty. But given the severe devastation the Revolutionary War wrought on their homelands, and the loss of life that their people experienced during the war, they chose to resist diplomatically. The Haudenosaunee spent 10 long years educating American diplomats in Haudenosaunee diplomacy, and their efforts culminated in the Treaty of Canandaigua in 1794. As our conversations with Claudio and Alyssa have revealed, our study of the American Revolution is incomplete when we don't look west and when we don't examine its immediate and ongoing consequences for Native American peoples. Life in North America was interconnected and interdependent. The American Revolution disrupted some of these connections, which meant, just as we saw in terms of Haudenosaunee and American diplomatic relationships, these connections had to be reforged and reshaped after the Revolution. Be sure to visit the show notes page for more information about our guest historians, their publications, and for notes from our conversations. benfranklinsworld.com/163. At the beginning of this episode, you heard music from the Men's Smoke Dance performed by members of the Seneca Nation at the Marvin Joe Curry Veterans Powwow in Salamanca, New York in 2017. The music was sung by Alan Dowdy, and I'd like to thank Gainu Printup for allowing me to use the music he recorded in his video of the event. You'll find a link to Gainu's video of the smoke dance on the show notes page, and I highly recommend you take a look. Likewise, the music you heard in between segments was part of the Water Song, written by Teresa Bear Fox and sung by the Haudenosaunee women singers. These singers are part of the Mohawk Nation, and there's a link to the video of the full song in the show notes. The Omohundro Institute and the Great Courses Plus made today's episode possible. To claim your 1-month unlimited free trial of all the courses the Great Courses Plus has to offer, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. Finally, how does looking at the American Revolution within the context of what was going on across the North American continent change your view of the period's history? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.